You know how I talked about it's very much like no, no, no. Like we don't take our right away from. I mean, we have the right to an abortion. Don't do this. But what is the counter narrative to that? Like, what is the positive narrative? You know that often also in abortion messaging, it's often a very safe space because they talk about abortions in the context of health overwhelmingly. So they don't just say, you know what, I'm a woman and I have a career and I don't want to have a baby because I don't want to have a baby. Or I'm a sex worker and I don't want to have a baby because I don't. They rarely show stories that are a little bit more what they would deem controversial. And as a result, I think they're not engaging with the majority of young women. And I realize that, you know, when we talk about pussy power, it's like just similar to when we talk about black power. We're embracing a power, the power of the pussy. And it's really interesting to me because when I do lectures, sometimes I have students try to draw out vaginas and they don't know how to draw a vagina. And I realize that we are in what's called the phallic imaginary. Bell Hooks called this, which says we are overwhelmingly in a phallic culture. And if you have a phallic culture, then you have a culture that is promoting rape. We are also living in a rape culture. If you have a culture that puts the penis and men's needs, patriarchy front and center, then we could, while we have to spend time dismantling patriarchy, we also need to move into the opposite direction, which is celebrating our vaginas, understanding that the way culture treats a vagina is ultimately related to our empowerment, right? And that the status that women are going to have, that we have to connect it, and that we have to talk about pleasure. Because I think especially with sex education and with sex overall, the analysis of pleasure is still overwhelmingly through a male lens, and we don't. I understand that as women of color, we've been so hypersexualized that we are missing the language to be able to talk about what we want. And even if you look at, you know, like one of my favorite writers, Junot Diaz, and some of these novels that are coming out by men of color writers, and Latino writers in particular, the stories about women are still about us being like, oh, you know, I kind of don't, or it's a very passive way of seeing us as sexual beings. So my proposition in the cultural space is that if we are living in a phallic culture, which we are, if we're living in a culture in which rape is normalized, then what is the contrary to that? And I believe that the contrary to that is pussy power and pleasure, and really owning the fact and giving young women especially, young women and all women, but young women especially, the tools to be able to have agency over their bodies and advocate what they want. The other thing is that as I began to be more out about my identity, I realized how much of a safe space I was creating for other people of color to talk about exploring open relationships or polyamory. And so I realized that as an artist, I can do this. I can talk about going to play parties or doing these things because art is a safe space. If I was an elected politician, do you know what would happen to me if I said that? I mean, I would get taken down. If I worked at a nonprofit, I probably would lose my job. I can't do that as a teacher, and as an artist, it's the ideal space to be able to share a story and to create a space for other people to ask. And the more that I began to create a space, it's almost like I would move the marker, you know, because I was like, okay, today I'll talk about attending a play party, and then I'll get all these questions, and I say, okay, then the next day I'll talk about wearing a strap-on for the first time, and then I move the dial, and each time there's more and more conversation. And then there was one moment I had in particular, which was that for the first time I tried this vibrator called the Sybian. I don't know if you guys have heard about the Sybian, but
spell it.
Sybian, and it was at this. I'm part of a community, and I'm very thankful to be part of the poly community, because when I was still exploring open relationships, it was very hard to find people to talk to. So when I joined a poly community just a few years ago, about 2.5 years ago, I was like, oh wow, now there's a space for me to talk to many other people, to couples, to single people, to queer folks, and really, you know, just have a space for conversation that I could then take back to my art, and to also take back to people I interact with, you know, and help, you know, push the conversation a little bit more to the, we call it the left, but definitely not towards the right. We're going to push away from that. So anyway, in my community, there's parties, and we get to go to parties, and it's a space, what I would call a very goddess space, which is where women show up. Women identified folks show up, and we kind of make the rules, and we are, in order to combat a very patriarchal society, we have a very woman-centered goddess space. And so one day I was like, oh, there's a machine there that looks really fun to ride, and I got really curious, and so I stood my place in line, because there was a line, and then I remember, you know, I'm an artist, and I really like to watch people. I like to watch people's faces, so I can draw them later. And I remember seeing two women get on the Sibian before me. There was two of them, actually. And I just noticed that they went into a trance. It's like at the beginning they were like, oh yeah, we'll see what this is. And then their eyes started rolling back, and they started perspiring, and then they just went into another dimension. And I was like, wow, like, I love my sisters. Like, my sisters are going into another space. They're going into their goddess subconscious. And nobody can mess with you when you're there. I don't know how to explain it. There was a sense of, like, power. And there was a sense that we are, like, coming from this just really powerful space where we can feel full agency over our bodies. And for a moment I was sad, because I was like, I've never seen that. I've never seen that. I watch, you know, queer porn, or I watch even like porn, and it's still, for some reason I was like, well, I haven't seen this level of goodness and like just positivity that is reached when women feel in full control over their sexual selves. And then you know, and then I was like, okay, it's my turn. So then I got on, and I was just like, what is going on? I was like, I'm 35 years old. I have never had an orgasm like that in my life. Okay, and it was amazing, because I realized, and I was awesome also to have coaches there, that there are two kinds of orgasms. There's a vaginal orgasm and a clitoral orgasm. And even though I had read about that, you know, I had not really experienced it. And when I did, I feel like an empowered woman. I feel like a badass. But at that moment, I was on another level. And I really, in my heart, felt that I want to open doors for like women to go there, you know? And I just feel like, why does it have to be such a unique situation for us to learn about how to fully pleasure ourselves? It shouldn't be the exception, it should be the norm. And that how far has patriarchy worked, that we're not there. We're not even close to there, you know? So I realized that for me, and that I really wanted to not just talk about our right to abortion, I want to talk about our right to pleasure as us being our full human empowered selves, and you know, just being our goddess selves, you know. And so I've been doing that more and more with my work. Actually, that piece is called My Vagina, My Orgasm, and My Imagination. And then Naomi Wolf just came out with a book. It's called Vagina. It's an autobiography, and she actually breaks down the science. So she says the science is all there. It's all there. So basically, when a woman has an orgasm, the way that we're wired is that we get like our nerves are connected to our brains, and when we have an orgasm, it activates the brain so that we are more creative, we feel more bold, more confident, and all these other things, which, I mean, it's no secret. Just when you see your homegirls or your mom or whatever, and they've just had sex, I'm serious, you can see it. You can see it. You see something. It's like you can just feel that energy. So anyway, she makes the scientific case, which she also makes the case that this is actually why when women are raped, that it is not just trauma, it's brain damage. Because where you are addressing the way that women are wired and our nerves, are very connected to our vaginas. And so, anyway, all this to say that I understood this not just to be about, oh, you know, it's a much broader conversation around feminism and around embracing pleasure. And I think that we're just so far from that. I mean, even, you know, it says up there, it says, there is no shame in having an abortion. Come out, share your story, break the silence. I had an abortion when I was 19 years old, and I didn't talk about it until in the last few years. You know that 1 in 3 women in the United States has an abortion? And yet the silence and the stigma is so strong that we don't talk about it. And by us being silent, the right wing is defining the conversation, and they're making laws. Because these 1 in 3 women, that means the lovers, the mothers, the sisters of all these crazy right-wingers have had abortions, and yet they're not coming out. And so that's when it relates to reproductive justice. When it relates to our sexual freedom, we're in an even more shameful space. And so when, you know, going back to the thing of culture, there was once a shameful and stigmatized to be a gay man in this country, or to be a lesbian, or to be queer. And that shifted. And so how can we shift the conversations around sex, especially, well, women, because I also think that men are equally impacted by patriarchy. And frankly, I think that if men could, if they could get the tools to really learn how to better please their female lovers, I actually think they would be all into that. You know, I definitely have seen that when I give lectures. The men are like, yo, you know, we don't know, we don't learn this stuff. This piece is the piece I just talked about. But that's what I'm trying to do in my art, is to think through how do we have experiences to talk about pleasure, and where can I push it a little bit. So I've been thinking, especially, like, wouldn't it be awesome if I can, like, build one of these things and make, like, a huge vagina that we come into and we do demos. Like, you know, let's do demos. Like, how do you do a vulva massage, or how do you, you know, just these things that we can. It's called embodied learning. I'm trying to figure that out. I was just in Indiana, of all places, and I had this similar lecture. And some young women came up to me and they're like, you know what, we're so inspired, we're going to plan an orgasm fest in the quad of our college, because we are just so tired of these, you know, patriarchal fucking fraternities. And so what we're going to do is we're not going to go protest them. We're going to have our own space where we talk about what we like. And that's going to set another tone. And so it was just really exciting and empowering to see how these young women were like, all, you know, they were just all into it. They were already planning, that's the work that I'm trying to do. This piece is called Over the Rainbow. There's a lot of people having sex here, you know, one thing that I was just talking to my friend Leah, and just, I mean, at the root of this is also our challenge in learning how to love, because we are in such a heteronormative way of loving that really it doesn't work for the majority of the population. I mean, people, the divorce rates are out of control, and I mean, as a poly person, I'm very aware at how non-poly people engage in cheating and lying and dishonesty, and that's the norm. That's what's normalized. So how can we shift that and not, you know, I think right now when people say you're poly, you're like the orbiting out hippie out there, which is really weird, because when even like the right wingers or the left wingers, they all talk about honesty, family, truth-telling, and all these things as values, and those values are not practiced when it comes to love and relationships and sex. So that's the gist of it. This piece is called Poly. It has 4 lovers in there. And that's what I'm trying to do in my work, and you will see more of this. I'm trying to not just make art. I'm trying to have conversations and also have experiences, shared experiences. So if you have ideas around, you know, events where people can really learn, I think that we need to move beyond the theoretical space and like really engage in some real learning here. Then that would be great. So with that, I'll close it out, and Ashara is going to facilitate some Q&A and discussion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank and honor you for bringing it and just being yourself. And you know, a lot of what we talk about here at the Hub is around bringing your authentic self and all that you are and all that you desire to be, and that we talk about desire. You know, and when we have these so-called business models that are like so-called successful and proven and they happen all over the world and whatnot, sometimes we get caught in these little boxes of saying there's only one way to have a conversation, or these are the kinds of conversations that happen in co-working spaces or so-called professional venues. And so inside on the gallery, we want to continue to have conversations that just break out of the box. There ain't no damn box.
Yeah.
That's really what it is. So I know we framed this conversation tonight around, around womanism, sex, and art. So in your conversation this evening, you talked a lot about identity and you talked a lot about access. And so I want to talk a little bit about the idea of womanism, and then maybe just put a couple, have a conversation the way that we did. And for those of you who weren't at the first session, so this is part 2. There was an opportunity for people to really take a deeper dive into the conversation around polyamory, because where else would you have that kind of conversation if you weren't sitting in front of someone who was outing themselves about being part of that community? And it's I think, kind of the shaming piece and the silence piece are, one of the many ways in which we continue to live in this mythology of disconnectedness, when we actually are independent upon one another to be able to heal, and that humans actually cannot transcend or transform any of their ills without interaction with another being, and often that being is another human. But so I guess I want to talk a little bit about feminism and womanism. When we first put the flyer up, I had several people say, "Well, what is womanism? And what does that mean? And why are you not calling it feminism?" And I realized that perhaps I was dating myself, because I'd say when I was 23 years old, Alice Walker coined this term, womanism. And so I'm going to read just a little bit around maybe not the difference, but just the interconnection and the intersection of feminism and womanism, that both feminism and womanism are dedicated to establishing equal opportunity and treatment for women. But womanism is specifically focused on Black gender struggle and is steeped in the experiences and histories of Black women, men, and families. The saying goes, a commitment to the survival of the wholeness of an entire people is the difference between a feminist conversation or discourse and a womanist conversation or discourse. And so when we talk about, here's a Black woman's experience, for me, we're talking about the experience of women who do not have the privilege of living in whiteness. So our culture is steeped in whiteness, the norm is whiteness, but that there are those of us who don't have the opportunity to say, you know what, this is my primary identity. So I just want to put that out there as a framework for our conversation. And then when we talk about feminist theory and feminist culture, there's been these waves and these trends of it. It is very much an insulated kind of academic conversation. If you're not part of that community inside the temple, you're not having that kind of conversation on a regular basis. So people don't hear those terms. And what we have done is, as we live and perpetuate a culture where feminism is seen as this kind of like idea that is against men. It's like it's totally, it's put to the side. So we want to continue to have conversations about the intersection. So earlier today we talked about the edge and the principles of permaculture, where we're talking about how do systems meet one another, and that juiciness in the middle part where all of this other goodness happens. An example that I use is where the ocean meets the shore. And what you see right there in the middle, or where the road meets the highway, or the ports meets the highway, and you see the things that collect in that space, and you find all kinds of goodies in there. So let's talk a little bit about media. You kind of went all over the place. You were on reproductive justice, you were on media, you were on policy, you were on immigration and migration. I want to talk a little bit about media, because the medium, your particular medium, happens to be printmaking, as well as some other things, but in particular for this show that's coming down this week, that these are prints. And these pieces I want to talk about because you hung them later in the exhibition about what material that is, and if that's also called printmaking. But Can we talk a little bit about, I say, the structure of identity based generationally? So you're 36?
35.
35. I'm 46. And so we've known each other 10 years.
Yeah.
So we've been having these conversations in Denver and I think in the DNC and the RNC. And so we've been having these conversations around gender identity and media and how that shows up.
Yeah.
And last week you and I were together, or 2 weeks ago we were together in San Francisco. And you presented at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art conversation on visual activism. Visual activism. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of feminist theory and how that shows up in terms of sexuality and womanist theory in your art. Particularly, let's pick someone like Beyonce, for instance, and how the conversation generationally and her coming out as a so-called feminist sparked a new conversation with girls, women, teenagers, and women of color around what that meant.
So first, I work in prints just because I'm a visual artist and it's my medium, but I think that there's so much more that I want to do, and really when I was going more and more to the play parties especially, and being in community with other communities, I realized, wow, like this is an experience, like it's almost like I'm in a performance, and how do I take that performance and take it to other areas? And I realized the power of storytelling too, and that just when I'm able to talk and I'm able to share, I mean, I'm not a poet, but I love to share and create I like to tell stories. So I've been really trying to think through, not just like limit myself to the printed medium, but try to think about, and also interestingly, I showed you a lot of my political work, and in a lot of these pieces, I think often people think of my work and they say, oh, you're a political artist, but I'm actually trying to break out of that, because I think that I'm a multi-dimensional human being, and I care about very different issues. I'm a complex human being, and sadly, in mainstream culture, only white people can be complex human beings. You see them in their films, and they're just like all different, contradictory, and yet
the media, exactly.
Yeah, you see people of color in such narrow, two-dimensional ways, and I try to not be that, and that's precisely why I consider myself an intersectional person, because I care equally about climate change as much as I care about women's issues and sexual freedom. But yeah, so I try to use as many, I mean, in Instagram, even the other day I shared a photo of a vibrator, and I was like, you know, saying, hey, all, I highly recommend this. And I realized that was a space to have a conversation. So I think mainly I'm trying to, more and more I care about shifting ideas, just like that action space, and I'm trying to find what are the best ways to do that, whether it's on social media or through my visual artwork, or through, you know, just being able to go to Indiana and talk about having orgasms and inspiring all these young women, majority of them white, but that's cool, to have an orgasm festival. I was like, okay, that is art right there. That is a, you know, I just felt that's exactly what I want to do, because, I mean, even when every time I come out about my abortion, at least, especially at the college level, at least 2 or 3 young women will come up to me and say, I've had one too, and I'm so happy that you shared, because I've never wanted to share. And so I feel like I want the things to manifest in like in multimedia kind of.
Sure. So continuing on that thread around media, how media is used, we'll get to Beyonce in a minute. I want to talk about perhaps how men engage with you in this conversation around, or do they engage in this conversation around gender and around sexuality and pleasure in particular?
Yes, you will be surprised how much they engage. And first, again, I think patriarchy is, first I think men of color are suffering so much. And you know why? Is because there is a system that wants to put them in prison. They have such limited chances. They get, so many of my, young male friends, like since they were in high school, they were getting suspended. As a result, they started, stole a pair of pants, got tracked into jail, can't get rid of that thing on their record, and therefore can't get a job. It's like a freaking cycle. And I see And you know, like as a woman of color, when I look through the racial justice analysis, like men are suffering, and patriarchy and racism is especially looking at men of color as a pipeline to prison, and you know, or as a low labor sector. And so I recognize that with a lot of love, because I grew up with brothers, and I grew up with, you know, just young men of color, my peers, and as a result, I never developed, even though I witnessed them inflicting pain on others. I understand that where that is rooted, and I really want I want to acknowledge that young men are suffering, and patriarchy makes them suffer. What I've noticed, and we saw this the other day, is that when we created a space for people to talk about this, a lot of even, like, there was 2 older black gentlemen here who were like, yo, I got questions, like, right. I got out of prison, and like, I don't know how to have these conversations, but I want to learn. And, you know, I want to be a better man. And I see more and more men's circles forming where men are challenging, and they're saying, we want the patriarchy to stop with us. We're going to be the generation that stops it. And how do we do that? We engage in our suffering together. We talk about the ways in which the things we learned about being a man are all wrong, and that in reality being a man means honoring the women in our life, and supporting them, and supporting their leadership, and getting completely behind them, being present for the children in the community. So it's been really awesome. And
they were particularly interested in how to have conversations with the younger generation.
Yeah, exactly.
They were particularly interested in it.
Yeah.
And those 2 men had both been in prison for more than a decade.
Yeah, and that's what I found. And you had told me that later, and I was like, wow. What happened is that I feel like the love is shared. Yes. When we share it from a loving thing, we create a safe space so that we could say, you know what, brothers, like, we know you're suffering too, and we're, you know, but this is, let's tackle this together. When I was just in Indiana, actually, it was majority white students, and we talked about patriarchy, and we talked about rape culture. And as you know, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but the Greek system is taking on rape, because they realize that so much of the so much crazy shit is happening in the fraternities, and so many of them are having these, you know, workshops for the people in the system. But of course, they're all really wonky, and nobody is listening. So then a young man got up and he said, well, you know, what can I do? I mean, I'm seeing this happen in my dorm. And I was like, well, why don't you connect with the sisters who are doing the Orgasm Fest, and why don't you have a space where women can come talk and really challenge you on some of the things that they're noticing, and you create a space where you open it up. So overall, I've noticed that there's a willingness to engage, but again, it's because I'm not talking about facts and figures. I have to bring it back to my personal experience, and I also have to talk about it through the same language that they're talking about it. And again, like if we don't have the conversation around pleasure, or around, you know, how women are feeling satisfied, or even men for that matter, like how it is that you can have a mutually thing, then you can't talk, you know, you can't have a conversation here when you're not really discussing what people are imagining. So overall, I have felt like really great. I felt a really great response, which makes me realize also how much there's not tools for them. And you know,
patriarchy hurts everyone.
Yeah.